Chapter 1. The World on the Eve of Revival. A continent in crisis. Before the great revivals of the 18th century swept across Europe, the continent was in deep moral and spiritual trouble. Early 1700s, Britain was a nation drifting. Gin consumption had reached catastrophic levels. Entire neighborhoods were drowning in addiction, poverty, and violence. Writers of the time described streets filled with drunkenness and despair, and the poor selling their last possessions for another cup of cheap gin. The Church of England, which should have been a stabilizing force, had grown cold. Many clergy held multiple paid positions, rarely visiting the congregations they were supposed to serve. Church appointments were often given to friends and relatives rather than to men of spiritual depth. One historian described the church of that era as little more than a government department, useful for maintaining order, but spiritually lifeless. Outside the established church, the nonconformist congregations were not much better. The fire of the Puritans had faded. Their successors preached long, dry sermons to shrinking congregations. What had once been a movement of passionate devotion had become a routine of religious respectability. Intellectually, the climate was equally hostile to living faith. The Enlightenment had elevated human reason above all else. In its extreme form, it produced deism, the belief that God created the world, but then stepped back and left it alone. Among the educated classes, Christianity was increasingly dismissed as outdated and unnecessary. Into this world, corrupt, exhausted, and spiritually empty, the fires of revival were about to fall. And pause with that for a moment. Dead churches, drunk cities, a culture that had intellectually dismissed God. Every generation that has hosted a great revival looked exactly like this before the fire came. Darkness has never disqualified a generation from revival. Historically, it has been the invitation for one. The Moravian precedent, Herrnhut, 1727. Before revival reached Britain, something remarkable happened in a small German village called Herrnhut. Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf had offered refuge on his land to a group of persecuted believers known as the Moravian Brethren. They were descendants of the followers of Jan Hus, driven from their homeland by persecution. The community was full of internal conflict until the morning of 13 August 1727. During a communion service, the people present experienced a sudden and overwhelming sense of God's presence. Men and women wept, confessed their sins, and cried out in prayer. The entire community was transformed in a single day. From that moment, the Moravians began a prayer meeting that continued without interruption, day and night, for 100 years. Their prayer became the spiritual engine that would ignite revival across continents. The Moravians profoundly shaped the coming awakening. It was a Moravian missionary who helped John Wesley discover living faith. It was a Moravian community that modeled the kind of spiritual depth Wesley longed for. Their burning devotion, their global missionary vision, and their disciplined prayer life became the pattern for every revival that followed. Think about that. 100 years of unbroken prayer. Not 100 days, not 100 weeks, a century. A community of refugees, barely holding together, became the spark that lit the Great Awakening. Revival always begins in a room where someone refuses to stop praying. Jonathan Edwards and the First Stirrings in New England. The first clear signs of awakening in the 18th century appeared, not in Europe, but in New England. In the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, the ministry of Jonathan Edwards, one of America's greatest theological minds, sparked a remarkable move of God in 1734 and 1735. Edwards recorded the events in a book titled A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God. It described hundreds of conversions, a dramatic change in the moral character of the town, and physical responses such as weeping, crying out, and people collapsing under conviction, manifestations that would later appear in revivals across Europe. His account was published in London in 1737 and read widely. Among those who devoured it was a young Anglican clergyman named George Whitefield, who would soon become the most influential preacher of the age. George Whitefield, the voice that shook a continent, early life and conversion. George Whitefield was born in Gloucester, England, in 1714, the youngest of 7 children. His parents ran the Bell Inn, and after his father died, young George helped his mother manage the business. From childhood, he showed a natural gift for performance, acting, mimicry, and public speaking came easily to him. In 1732, he entered Pembroke College, Oxford, on a scholarship that required him to serve wealthier students in exchange for his education. It was at Oxford that he met John and Charles Wesley and the group, mockingly called the Holy Club. Whitefield's conversion in 1735 was dramatic. After months of intense spiritual struggle, he experienced what he described as a new birth, a deep, unmistakable assurance of God's love. He wrote that God had removed the heavy load and given him a living faith. The open-air preacher. Whitefield was ordained in 1736 and immediately drew attention. His preaching was bold, emotional, and direct. When church pulpits closed to him, he took the unprecedented step of preaching outdoors. In February 1739, he preached to the coal miners of Kingswood, near Bristol. These were men hardened by poverty and neglect, men who rarely attended church. Whitefield began with a crowd of 200. Within weeks, tens of thousands gathered to hear him. He described the unforgettable sight of coal-blackened faces streaked with white lines where tears had cut through the soot. Picture that scene. Men society had forgotten, men the church had ignored, and yet they wept because someone finally told them that God loved them. Revival always goes first to the people the world has written off. Whitefield's preaching power. Whitefield's voice was legendary. Benjamin Franklin once calculated that he could be heard clearly by 30,000 people in an open square. Actors, politicians, and critics alike marveled at his ability to move crowds. But his power was not just in volume. He preached with vivid drama, acting out scenes, shifting voices, and speaking as though addressing each listener personally. In a society divided by class, his directness was revolutionary. Wales, the parallel revival. While Whitefield shook England, a parallel revival was rising in Wales. Howell Harris, converted in 1735, began preaching across the Welsh countryside with extraordinary effect. He faced mobs, violence, and opposition from clergy, yet crowds gathered wherever he went. Harris soon met Daniel Rowland, whose preaching at Llangeitho drew people from miles away. In 1762, a powerful awakening broke out during communion services there. Witnesses described scenes of shouting, weeping, and overwhelming conviction, manifestations that would appear again in later revivals. The movement Harris and Rowland built eventually became the Calvinistic Methodist Church, one of the most influential forces in Welsh Christianity. John Wesley and the Methodist Revival. The Aldersgate Experience. John Wesley, born in 1703, was deeply religious long before he was truly converted. He prayed, fasted, served the poor, and even traveled to America as a missionary, yet he lacked assurance of salvation. Everything changed on the evening of the 24th of May, 1738. While listening to a reading from Martin Luther's commentary on Romans, Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed. In that moment, he trusted Christ alone for salvation and received the assurance he had long sought. That quiet encounter transformed him. Within months, he joined Whitefield in open-air preaching, something he once considered improper. He later wrote, "I submitted to be more vile," meaning he was willing to break convention to reach the lost. Never underestimate the power of an ordinary moment. One warmed heart became the spark that helped set a nation on fire. Wesley's organizing genius. Wesley's greatest gift was organization. He created Methodist societies, small groups that met weekly for accountability, teaching, and spiritual care. These class meetings preserved the fruit of revival and created a strong, disciplined community. Over 50 years, Wesley traveled more than 200,000 miles, preached around 40,000 sermons, and built a movement that transformed the moral landscape of Britain. Scotland, the Kirk, and the Revival. In Scotland, revival broke out in places like Cambuslang and Kilsyth in 1742. Under the preaching of William McCulloch and James Robe, experienced deep conviction and conversion. Whitefield visited and preached to crowds of up to 30,000. These events became known as the Scottish Great Awakening and left a lasting mark on the Church of Scotland. The social impact of the Methodist Revival. The revival reshaped British society. Drunkenness declined, families stabilized, crime fell. Communities once known for violence became centers of sobriety and learning. Wesley also fought against slavery, encouraged education, and supported the poor. Some historians argue that Methodism helped prevent a violent revolution in Britain by transforming the moral character of the working classes. Wesley's death and legacy. John Wesley died in 91 at the age of 87. His final words were, "The best of all is God is with us." He left behind a movement that spanned continents and reshaped Christianity. The First Great Awakening created a model: open-air preaching, lay leadership, small groups, and social reform that influenced every revival that followed.